Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Talking Politics. My name is Nico Johnson. I'm the political correspondent here. And today we have with us David Marcus, who is, of course, the New York correspondent at the Federalist. He's written pretty much everywhere you can think of. And he may be, I think, the most good-looking man in journalism. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nico.
So if I may start with quite a broad question, so do forgive me. We've seen a pretty tumultuous year in American politics. It obviously started with the pandemic, which then went into the lockdown, which then brought about the BLM movement. And finally, we're seeing an attack on statues. So how have we managed to get to this point?
Well, the attack on statues thing isn't all that new. It bubbles up whenever sort of like racial tension bubbles up. So if you go back to Charlottesville, for example, that whole mess was started when the alt-right, Unite the Right crazies went down to sort of defend a statue of Lee and stuff. I mean, yeah, it's all been pretty crazy. I think that the frustration of the pandemic certainly fed into the protests and then the rioting and looting and stuff, and then the attacks on the statues. But the statues have been a long time coming. And if you recall, when this first bubbled up back in 2017, President Trump, as well as many of us on the right, said, well, wait a minute, okay, you're taking down Confederate statues. What about George Washington? What about Thomas Jefferson? They owned slaves. And everybody laughed. They said, no, that's a slippery slope. That's a straw man. That'll never happen. NBC News and the New York Times spoke to all these historians. And of course, it's what happened. Because once you start pulling down statues, it doesn't tend to stop. So yeah, we're quite a point.
We are indeed, but it's not even like this is being broadly condemned by Democrats in particular. But surely there isn't votes in allowing these people to tear down American history.
No, there aren't, which I think we're figuring out. One of the weird things about the Confederate statue issue is the disconnect between the media and public opinion. So the last pretty good poll on this was about 2 weeks ago, and it showed that 55% of Americans oppose taking down Confederate statues. Confederate, right? Not founding fathers, Confederate. Only 45% of the liberal media is in favor of taking down these statues. The entirety of the mainstream media is in favor of it. And half the conservative media is. So 80% of the media wants these statues to come down when that's only the will of 45% of the people. It's a strange and relatively unique situation.
Yeah. So you mentioned Confederate statues, but surely, and again, I think it's pretty obvious that you shouldn't just deface them in public without democratic procedures. But surely there is a distinction between, say, Thomas Jefferson and Confederate statues. Why should we keep up Confederate statues in the States? These guys are traitors.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple answers to that. One of which is that after a certain period of time, these structures, these works of public art, become a part of a community, and I think you have to think about that before you start pulling at those threads of the tapestry. But more broadly, I'm not sure that we can make such a clean distinction between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were slave owners, and the Confederate generals. I've seen relatively compelling arguments that say there's a bright line to be drawn there. I've never seen it in action, because what we had over the past 3 weeks was not just mobs, right? The governments in Boston and DC started moves to take down statues of Abraham Lincoln. City Council in New York City made a move to take down a statue of Jefferson in City Hall. Obviously, the Teddy Roosevelt statue outside of the Museum of Natural History. So, it never actually happens. It's all well and good to say, okay, this is our limiting principle, and this only applies to traitors, but it obviously doesn't. Now, one thing I do think that Trump's speech changed that narrative a little bit, and I suspect now, having looked at the polling, you're not going to see so many efforts by local Democratic officials to go after these statues. It doesn't poll well. It's not what Joe Biden wants to be talking about.
So you thought the Mount Rushmore speech was good?
I thought it was good. I wasn't as sort of googly-eyed over it as some of my colleagues were, but yeah, I thought it was solid, and I just thought one piece of evidence for that is that rather than dealing with the speech that Trump actually gave, most of the media invented an entirely different speech that he never gave to attack. So they decided that this speech was all about Confederate statues, even though he had never mentioned Confederate statues. So yeah, I mean, I think the full-throated defense of the American founders and of America was pretty effective, and I think that the Democrats got the message that this is not what they want to be fighting over.
And there have been less attacks on statues over recent weeks. I mean, again, I don't live in America, but from up north, it seems that it's calmed down as the protests have begun to calm down as well. And this will be just a blip, perhaps, in American history where we did go after these statues. But anyway, it seems to me, and I don't know whether you agree with me here, but the same people who tear down statues are the same as the people, or the same sort of people rather, who cling to the environmental movements, the same sort of people who are particularly militant about the lockdown, and then they were as well, they're pretty militant about the Black Lives Matter protests. And I wonder what this has to do with sort of the meaninglessness of the modern world. They cling to any movement that is slightly bigger than themselves, and if you are to criticize it, it equates to blasphemy. And I mean, do you think I'm onto something here?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. I think one of the writers on race issues who I really have a lot of respect for is John McWhorter, who's a professor at Columbia University. These questions of critical race theory and privilege theory and Black Lives Matters and all this stuff. He says it's a religion, and I think he's right. And I think tying back into what you're saying, we live at a time now where people are not finding their solace and meaning in God or through church, so they're gonna have to try to find something else. And I mean, for 150 years, Marxists have been right there saying, "Boy, we got a good substitute for you here." I mean, of course, it's a lie, but it's a tempting one.
It is eerily familiar to sort of a cultural revolution. It's pretty scary. But even then, it hasn't gained more ground anywhere else aside from the US. In Britain, the attacks on Winston Churchill and Gandhi were broadly condemned. In Canada, we haven't really had attacks on statues, but again, they are usually condemned by nearly everyone. The media in the US is so willing, they practically encourage it. It's baffling to me. I don't understand it. It's like they're on a different, playing field here. So why are they so? Why do they find it so? Sorry, someone's fucking calling me. Yeah, here, let me do that again. So I look at the US, and I don't think this movement to attack statues has gotten ground anywhere else. So in Britain, it's been broadly condemned. In Canada, it's been broadly condemned. Yet the media in the US practically encourage it. I find it totally baffling. Why is that?
There's a few theories on this. People who I really respect in the sort of like education realm make some very good arguments that our education system has just gotten so completely off the rails in terms of how we teach our own history, that we've convinced ourselves that we're the bad guys, which I think, given the history of the world, is strange, but it does often sort of come across that way. But, I think another reason, this is something Sohrab Ahmari has written about this. He's the op-ed editor at the Post, New York Post, where I also write. And he's tapped into this sort of interesting thing about like the difference between now and 1968, for example, is that like the corporate world was not on board with the protesters in 1968. Now they are. And Sohrab was like, why? Like, why would these capitalist corporations be on board with this Marxist movement? And what he sees, and I agree with him to a large extent, is that Trumpian populism, if you will, or if you want to take it across the pond, Brexit populism,
Mm.
right, is a threat to a significant part of the corporate order who really rely on globalism and trade and a lot of things that
Yeah.
that Trump and Nigel Farage and these guys threaten. And so I think some of that is playing out here as well, where a lot of these corporate interests really had both parties in their back pocket for the better part of my adult life. I mean, stretching back into the 90s. Trump changed that, Brexit changed that. And so I think that corporations themselves find themselves in a different place, and that's why they're quicker to jump on these bandwagons.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I didn't think about that. On the subject of Trump's populism and swinging to the new election, Trump, it appears to me, this year at least, has presided over total chaos. Again, the economy, which was going to be his greatest reference point in the election, is no longer something he can point to. He essentially antagonized certain protesters on Twitter during obviously the Black Lives Matter movement. And on top of that, he's dealt with the pandemic in a way which has condemned America to be amongst the worst countries in the world. So, do you think it's possible that Trump can win this election? It seems inevitable to me that Biden will take this.
Oh, it's certainly possible. You know, as always with an American presidential election, you have to remember that this really comes down to about 5 or 6 states. Um, Biden's national lead right now is around 9 points. In those swing states, he's anywhere between like 3 and 7. So certainly within like striking distance. Yeah, I mean, listen, Biden right now, before college basketball brought in the shot clock, University of North Carolina used to have this play called Four Corners. So
Yeah,
if there were a few minutes left in the game and they were winning, they'd just spread out and pass the ball to each other. They wouldn't even try to score, right?
right.
And then the clock would run out and they'd win. I think that's the Biden campaign right now, right? They like where they are right now. They're perfectly happy to have him sitting in the basement. Now, what's going to happen that's going to be fascinating and unprecedented is, you know, the Democrats have basically said we're not having an in-person convention. They'll have some kind of made-for-TV event or whatever they're going to do.
Yeah,
The Republicans are still at this point planning on having a traditional in-person convention, which I really hope they do because I haven't left New York City in 4 months, and I'd be happy for a little vacation. But that if that's how that plays out, that'll be a really interesting dynamic. And I think to some extent frame this election, and I think where Trump wants to frame it is between a Trump campaign that wants things to get back to normal and a Biden campaign that has accepted that there's going to be this new normal and we're never going back to normal again. So I think that's a dynamic that I think the Trump campaign will try to flesh out as the months go on.
and it works on Biden's side of it in a way, because as soon as you get this guy out of his basement, as you said, he makes some sort of blunder, which has people talking on Twitter, or at least journalists talking on Twitter, over whether he's had some sort of cognitive downfall over the past few months. So it seems to me, and I don't know what you think about Biden's alleged cognitive decline, that they're trying to avoid that. And if Biden does win this, it's just going to be the DNC running the show.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't have any opinion on Biden's alleged cognitive decline. I'm not a big fan of this. I didn't like it when they did it to Hillary. I don't like when they do it to Trump. I just don't have evidence for it. The guy's always been kind of goofy.
Yeah,
You know, I grew up in Pennsylvania, so I've been watching Joe Biden since I was 15. Like he's a gaffe machine. He always has been. I don't know that it has anything to do with cognitive decline. But yeah, I mean, this is the perfect storm for his candidacy. I mean, this is really like, you know, it keeps him out of the way, and I'm not sure there's a lot that Trump can do about that, except again try to draw out that comparison. But a lot of that's going to depend on where this virus goes, and frankly, I mean, the coronavirus is the worst possible crisis for a Donald Trump. There's times when his rhetorical style works really well. I think it works really well in trade negotiations. I think it works really well in foreign affairs sometimes. that sort of like blustering Queen's attitude that he has, Queen's New York, that is. It's really bad for a pandemic.
Yeah.
You really need a measured response, and he's not capable of it. I mean, he just goes out and says, "I'm doing the greatest job that anybody's ever done," which is fine. But it just isn't. It's just not playing well in this moment.
Yeah. So, last question: if I am to force you into a corner, who do you think will win the presidential election?
I mean, if it was held today, I think Biden would win. Yeah, I'll be a little risky. I think by a very slim margin, Trump can pull this out. He's got to pull that same inside straight again. He's going to need Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, all these states. But uh, ultimately, I think Trump can pull it out because I think that the people voting for Trump are voting for Trump, and the people voting for Biden are voting against Trump. And
Yeah.
polling bears this out. And I always think you're in a better position if people are going out to pull the ballot for you as opposed to against the other guy. But that having been said, I'm almost always wrong. So
Yeah. So perhaps you should go with your what you didn't say then. Well, I appreciate you answering the question. Journalists usually sort of tiptoe around that in fear of making a dodgy prediction. So thank you. And thank you so much for coming on. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure.